Well, good evening, ladies. Can you believe we are already into March now? Wow, time flies. This month's topic, we're going to be talking about hurting, pain, and unfortunately, that is just part of life. If you just think about it, life is all about a series of losses. That's unfortunate, but that's kind of the way it is. I know in my life, particularly, just for 16 years straight, you would find me in my apartment with my friend Ed. Ed was my eating disorder. I think some of you might refer to your eating disorder as Ed as well. And what I learned to do was detach emotionally from my crappy life by spending every day binging and purging. And unbeknown to me, what I was doing was I was getting rid of all those bad memories by flushing them down the toilet. Now, the Bible tells us that Satan is the god of this world. He disguised himself as Ed in my life. He stole my dignity, he stole my dreams, he lied to me endlessly, and he slowly destroyed my body. I gave in to another demon, alcohol. That was my secondary addiction. And unbeknownst again to me, I was deeply invested in not feeling bad and in medicating myself against painful feelings. And I had deceived myself in my mind that Ed was helping me. He wasn't hurting me. Because Ed had a really good way of reframing my sin. You know, I used to go out and I'd get drunk, and then I'd give my body away to guys who just threw me away. I had been betrayed by so many guys, only to be abandoned and then left alone to suffer the losses. And so my only option was to run back to Ed. Viktor Frankl said, "The one thing you can't take away from me is the way I choose to respond to what you do to me." Now, one of the many consequences of my promiscuity is I got pregnant. And then I justified having an abortion. I also got caught for shoplifting. I got a DUI. I went to jail. And so the shame and the pain, it just kept accumulating year after year. I wanted to be free from my eating disorders. I'm sure so many of you have wanted to be. And so maybe you did what I did. I tried reading a lot of secular books, a lot of healing programs. But you know what? I only came out a more educated addict. And what I know now is when we feel unloved and guilty and worthless and ashamed or weak, our sense of self is threatened. And our brain is going to try to find ways to mask those painful feelings. And so we become masters at finding ways to mask those painful feelings. So the wounded basically have two choices in coping with trauma and pain. Now, we can either process through our emotions, or we can disengage and develop what we call either a coping skill or a defense mechanism to help us gain some kind of relief. And this is what most people tend to do. It keeps them moving forward, keeps them functioning, despite the fact that those toxic symptoms are still alive. Think of a coping mechanism as a behavior intended to undo the symptoms and memories of the trauma or the stressful event. So we all have these basic desires. We all want to be loved, we want to be accepted, we want to believe we're valuable, that we belong someplace. And so if any of these needs are not met, unconsciously, we're going to choose a behavior, a coping mechanism, in order to cope with that deficit. And what we need to do is when we choose a coping mechanism, those suppressed emotions don't go away. Now, we may have that trapped emotional pain, but also those suppressed emotions can turn into prolonged physical pain as well. When we regularly suppress and we block our emotions and we block memories, the intricate psychosomatic network in our brains is destabilized. Psychologists also say that we are less likely to delay gratification when we're sad or mad or hurt, which explains why we would go for a coping mechanism. Now, what I find so interesting is often our coping mechanisms, have you noticed, turn into compulsions, which means they're no longer choices anymore. Now, my coping mechanism early on was food. I began by choosing to diet and to control my food. But soon it got out of control because I became obsessed or compulsed, you could say, with dieting. Dieting was a compulsion. That led into an eating disorder. So, hey, I had no more free will left. All my choices had been taken away. Another thing that we see with coping mechanisms is a way that people try to handle what they can't handle is denial. Denial or delusion. It helps to keep that toxic experience from surfacing. One psychoanalyst, I like the way he phrased it. He says, we keep ourselves ignorant. Now, from a physiological perspective, our brain, what it does is it creates belief systems and models of reality. And so it always wants to cling to the way things were. So if you get new information such as you have an eating disorder, or you are an addict, or you are in an abusive relationship and you need to get help and you need to change, when that doesn't fit our model of reality, we're going to go for a defense mechanism because we want to accommodate our reality. So the brain is going to do anything to preserve a sense of its stable self. And that's why addictions are so common. Addictions not just to substances, but non-substances like over-exercising, sex, busyness. I mean, the list goes on and on. Also, defending what we've done by becoming angry. That is a coping mechanism. And what is really interesting about both anger and addictions is they dump chemicals into the body that literally numbs the pain. So it explains why they are such common coping mechanisms. I don't know if you knew this, but emotional pain or stress pain can become an addiction. Emotional pain addiction, also sometimes called emotional dependency, is when a negative feeling such as anger, guilt, worry, grief, fear, or depression, it becomes so entrenched and so habitual that you can't live without it. And basically what happens is it leads to a paralysis of our life and also of our faith. So when a person is continually stressed by emotional pain, there are subtle changes in the body which create a dependency on stress-related circumstances. So the emotional pain addict unconsciously seeks out situations that are going to result in pain. For example, sabotaging relationships, creating drama, right? Experts say that emotional addiction can be as hard to overcome as overcoming an addictive substance. And I kind of think of it as akin to us trying to overcome an eating disorder. It's very difficult to overcome an eating disorder because we need food to survive. We can't just eliminate it. And the same thing if you are addicted to your emotions. We're emotional creatures. We can't tell someone just to numb out. And so if you find perhaps that you are one who is addicted to your emotions or addicted to stress, or you know someone who is, I always recommend professional counseling. Some other common coping mechanisms are isolation, diversion, minimizing and justifying, rationalizing, making jokes all the time, rage, fantasizing, people-pleasing, codependency, projection, excessive sleeping, controlling, perfectionism and compulsiveness, depression and anxiety, abuse, acting out sexually, an eating disorder, self-mutilation and harm. Do any of these sound familiar to you? And sadly, what happens then, these new coping mechanisms become a new source of pain that we have to deal with. See, the problem is we can't heal what we can't feel. Kind of catchy little phrase, isn't it? Coping skills protect our wound, but they prevent healing. Now, I used to try behavior modification. I think back then we used to call it willpower. But the problem is with just merely changing your behavior, you don't get to the internal issues that need to be dealt with. You just conform to a new behavior. And we can't just modify our behavior because that pain is still there. It's like burying something alive. It's kind of like then we choose another behavior like musical chairs. So we have got to get to the underlying pain and deal with it. Plato said an unexamined life is not worth living. Now, your coping skill, it cannot protect you from the trauma of loss. It may delay it, but it's not going to make it disappear. If you give up your coping mechanism, that may just send you into a fear-related tizzy. And you may fear that you're going to go crazy, but let me tell you, you won't go crazy. You may have to grieve its loss, but you're not going to go crazy. Lamentations 3:40 says, instead, let us test and examine our ways. Let us turn back to the Lord. So if we're going to turn to a coping mechanism, let it be the Lord. A lot of you have heard of Lisa TerKeurst. She is an author of many books. She is the founder of Proverbs 31 Ministries. I like what she wrote. She said, the pain isn't the enemy. Pain is the indicator that brokenness exists. Pain is a reminder that the real enemy is trying to take us out and bring us down by keeping us stuck in broken places. Pain is the gift that motivates us to fight with the brave tenacity and fierce determination, knowing there's healing on the other side. Isn't that great? So we can go through what some people call the dark nights of the soul. Perhaps you've heard of that. But nowhere in Scripture are we given an answer to why there's unjust suffering. No human being has special immunity. We do know that our suffering forces us to face the fact, hey, that we're limited, we're weak, and we've got to depend on God to get through what we're going through. God never has promised and answered the pain. The only thing he has promised us is himself. And he is with us all the time. Even if what we've done, even if our troubles are based on something that we've done, a wrong that we've committed, he is still with us to help us through. One of his Hebrew names is Jehovah Rapha, and that means the Lord that heals. 1 Peter 5:10 says, the God of all grace, who calls you to his eternal glory in Christ, after you have suffered a little while, will himself restore you and make you strong, firm, and steadfast. I think that is such a great promise for healing. When we're in pain, I know it can feel like God is far away. It's so easy to want to isolate because of all those toxic feelings. But just know that God is very close, and we really need to be with other people. I always say, look for the breadcrumbs that God's leaving in your life. And it could be an encouragement from an unexpected source, like a friend that just calls you out of the blue, or maybe you're reading a quote, or you hear something on the radio program. Also, a breadcrumb would be just the strength to get your work done for the day, or maybe it's that gentle whisper in your heart. So I always say, look for God's breadcrumbs, because I think he's leaving them all over the place. So when you break into your groups, I have some questions you might want to consider talking about. I think it's important to talk about our coping mechanisms. It's a big part of, I know when I do counseling with people, we need to identify those coping mechanisms. So can you identify, based on that list that I gave you, any present day negative coping mechanisms you are using? And if the answer is yes, I have a two-part question. What do you fear is going to happen if you didn't numb yourself any longer with that coping mechanism? And when you think about letting go of that coping mechanism, how does that make you feel? Okay, so that could probably just take you into rest of the night. If you don't want to talk about that, also talk about how can you find God's breadcrumbs in your life? What does God's breadcrumbs look like? Or you might want to talk about how you can apply the two scriptures to your life. So anyway, enjoy your time together. I am thinking about you and praying for you. I know you're going to have an amazing night. I love you, and I will see you next month. So long.